are driven. You're the kind of person who doesn't just accept the surface level narrative handed down by mainstream media or legacy institutions.
Right. You want to look deeper.
Exactly. You want to uncover the hidden histories of our societal pillars. And you are seeking to understand the intense, rapidly shifting gender dynamics of the modern world.
Because you look around and you want to know what exactly happened to our institutions.
Yeah, our courts, our schools, the military. You want to know what they were like before they were, as some argue, captured by ideological movements.
Captured by feminists and Marxists, specifically according to the arguments we're looking at today.
And that burning curiosity is exactly why we are here. This deep dive is a fascinating, ultra-long and incisive exploration tailored specifically for you.
It's crafted especially for those of you seeking to thoroughly understand the foundational arguments of the men's rights and red-pilled manosphere movements.
Right. The underlying history and those specific perspectives. But before we jump into the deep end, I just want to give you a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show.
It really is the best way to ensure you never miss out on these comprehensive, no-holds-barred explorations.
It is. So today we are doing a massive, comprehensive review of a highly provocative, intensely debated new ebook. And I highly encourage you, if you want to see the raw data and read the arguments for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy this book.
And make sure you follow the author's latest updates and essays at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yes, at Conrad Riker on Substack. The source material we are unpacking today is an extensive, heavily researched ebook. It's titled Cuckoldry and Control, The Dark Side of Feminist Sexual Liberation.
And that's by Sophie Marie Eve Riker.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the book's very extensive, incredibly detailed claims about how modern institutions, stretching from the family court system all the way to academia,
And from the military-industrial complex to entertainment media.
exactly how they have allegedly been captured and fundamentally re-engineered by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
It is a massive text. We're talking hundreds of pages of dense sociological critique.
And it pulls absolutely no punches.
It really doesn't. But before we start breaking down Chapter 1, we do need to establish a very clear, crucial boundary for you, the listener.
This is important.
Today's deep dive explores highly politically charged, deeply controversial content. We want to state explicitly, right here at the top, that we are not taking sides.
We are not taking sides.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the political arguments, or the ultimate conclusions of the author. Our role here is strictly to act as your impartial guides through a very complex landscape.
We are going to faithfully report, map out, and analyze the claims.
The statistics and the historical interpretations exactly as they are presented in the source text.
Right, we're looking under the hood at the mechanics of the argument so you can thoroughly understand the terrain of this specific, highly influential viewpoint.
Absolutely. We're here to read the map, not tell you where to build your house.
I like that. So let's start right at the foundation of Riker's argument, which is a concept she calls the illusion of patriarchy.
The illusion of patriarchy.
Yeah. For anyone who spends time in these online spaces, you know the term patriarchy is thrown around constantly. But the book comes right out of the gate attacking the very premise that we live in a male-dominated society.
The author essentially calls patriarchy a ghost story.
A myth. A convenient catch-all scapegoat used to explain away every conceivable social ill. And she doesn't just, state this as an opinion. She brings in economic data.
Very specific data.
Yeah, the text cites Forbes 2020 data claiming that women actually control 60% of personal wealth in the United States.
Now, I want to pause here because that is a massive number.
It's huge. And Riker uses this to pose a really direct, almost mocking question. She asks, if the patriarchy is this omnipotent, oppressive force designed by men for the benefit of men, why aren't men hoarding all the cash?
Right.
How does the author explain the mechanics of that 60% figure?
Well, it's a striking statistic to open a book with, and it serves as the absolute linchpin for her systemic dismantling of mainstream feminist economic narratives.
So how does she explain it?
To answer your question, Riker explains that while men might occupy the hypervisible CEO roles,
The extreme outliers of wealth generation.
exactly the outliers, women actually control the vast majority of consumer purchasing power. And crucially, they inherit massive amounts of wealth due to longer life expectancies.
Oh, okay.
And the book uses this wealth statistic to pivot directly into an attack on probably the most widely cited piece of feminist economic theory, the 77-cent wage gap.
Right, because anyone who has debated this knows the 77-cent figure is just an unadjusted median. But what is Riker's specific angle here? Because she brings in economist Claudia Golden, right?
Yes, Nobel-winning economist Claudia Golden. Riker uses Golden's research to argue that the wage gap is not a product of systemic discrimination, but rather a perfect reflection of biological risk tolerance and evolutionary priorities.
Meaning what exactly?
The text claims that when you rigorously account for critical variables,
Like career choice?
specific career choice, tolerance for physical danger, the sheer number of uninterrupted hours worked, and temporal flexibility.
When you account for all of that, the wage gap essentially vanishes to within a couple of percentage points.
Yes. Riker's thesis is that men are biologically driven to choose higher paying but significantly more dangerous, soul-crushing jobs.
They're willing to work 80-hour weeks away from their families.
And they negotiate with a more aggressive, risk-acceptant baseline. She argues this isn't oppression.
It's a transaction.
A voluntary transaction where men trade their physical and temporal well-being for resource accumulation.
And that biological drive to accumulate resources at the expense of personal safety leads directly into one of the most compelling and, frankly, darkest concepts in the first section of the book.
The glass cellar.
The glass cellar. We always hear about the glass ceiling, right? The invisible barrier keeping women out of the boardroom. But the author points out that men overwhelmingly dominate the dangerous, low-paying, physically destructive jobs at the absolute bottom of society.
The absolute bottom.
And the book throws out some incredibly heavy statistics here. It notes that men make up 93% of workplace fatalities.
93%.
They die on oil rigs, in logging camps, and on construction sites. Furthermore, according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention data cited in the book, men have a suicide rate that is 3.88 times higher than that of women.
Almost 4 times as high.
And men comprise a staggering 70% of the homeless population.
So the text asks a very poignant question. If society is engineered to privilege men, where exactly is the privilege in dying on a scaffolding, taking your own life in despair, or freezing on a park bench?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The author uses the concept of the glass cellar, a term popularized by earlier men's rights advocates but expanded upon here, to argue that the feminist narrative of universal male privilege completely ignores the historical and ongoing sacrifices men have made.
Riker asserts that men are not the oppressors of society, but rather its utility players.
Utility place.
They're the ones who have always been expected to bear the brunt of societal hardships, to do the dirty, dangerous work, and to do it in absolute silence.
And the author's overarching psychological theory here is that society accepts male disposability because of an evolutionary imperative.
Sperm is cheap. Eggs are expensive.
Right. Therefore, societies naturally evolve to protect women and expend men. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the book doesn't just stick to modern occupational hazards or suicide statistics.
No, it goes much further back.
To prove this point about male sacrifice, Riker goes deep into history to show that men and women have historically been collaborators in survival, not adversaries in a power struggle.
She brings up the trenches of World War I.
Yes, she paints this incredibly visceral picture of millions of young men facing unimaginable horrors. Mustard gas, trench foot, artillery fire, dying in the mud of Europe.
And she argues that this ultimate sacrifice is casually erased or mocked by the modern myth of male privilege.
But she doesn't just focus on war. The text points to the co-ed guilds of medieval Europe.
The medieval guilds are a fascinating historical anchor for her argument. Riker is essentially attempting to completely rewrite the prevailing feminist historical narrative.
Instead of viewing history as a long, unbroken chain of female subjugation and male tyranny,
Riker presents history as a grueling story of division of labor.
born out of brutal economic necessity and mutual survival in a world where nature was constantly trying to kill everyone.
And the book highlights powerful historical women to prove that capability, not gender, often dictated influence.
She brings up Hatshepsut, who ruled as an ancient Egyptian pharaoh.
And Renaissance powerhouses like Isabella d'Este and Catherine de' Medici.
And what's crucial is how Riker claims these women ruled. She makes a point to say they didn't get to the top by starting a protest movement or smashing the patriarchy, right?
Precisely. The author's key point here is that these women didn't seize power in an ideological vacuum. They ruled with the vital, enthusiastic support, collaboration, and backing of male advisors, male generals, and male allies.
So they work together.
Riker argues that historically, successful societies operated on a model of complementary synergy between the sexes. Men provided the physical security and infrastructure,
Hmm.
while women provided the social cohesion, internal management, and biological continuation of the family line.
So, if that complementary synergy was the historical norm, Riker's argument is that this dynamic, men and women working together against a harsh world for mutual benefit, has been artificially dismantled.
Replaced by what she calls the modern gender war.
The gender war. The book claims this war is a completely false dichotomy. It's a distraction that serves the average man or woman no benefit whatsoever, but highly enriches the political ideologues, the academics, and the media corporations who profit from driving a wedge between the sexes.
And a massive casualty of that artificially constructed gender war, according to the text, is the modern male psyche.
Which brings us to what Riker coins the masculinity paradox.
Think of it like trying to run modern, highly sensitive software on an ancient, biologically hardwired hard drive.
The author uses this term to describe the impossible, contradictory standard placed on men today.
On one hand, society, and specifically, the author argues, modern women still covertly demand that men fulfill their traditional roles. Be a rock, be strong, be a stoic provider, and be unyielding in a crisis.
But simultaneously, modern cultural messaging demands that men be highly vulnerable, constantly in touch with their emotions, and ready to deconstruct their masculinity on command.
It's the ultimate double bind.
The book argues this creates a paralyzing no-win situation. If a man is too stoic, he's labeled toxic and emotionally unavailable.
But if he cries and shows true vulnerability, Riker argues, he is often subtly punished for it, losing the respect of his peers or his partner.
The text claims this paradox ultimately alienates men from their natural biological strengths. And this alienation really sets the stage for the book's deep dive into what fills that void.
The culture of victimhood.
The culture of victimhood. The author argues that modern feminism has taken the legitimate historical concept of victimhood and turned it into a massive, highly lucrative, institutionalized industry.
It's no longer about seeking justice for actual wrongs. It's a commodity.
It is a currency of power and a weapon of control. And the text gets incredibly specific and granular here. Riker highlights some truly harrowing case studies of false allegations to prove just how devastating this weaponized victimhood can be when it's wielded by the system.
What's fascinating here is how the author doesn't just lift these cases. She dissects them to illustrate a much broader systemic cultural shift.
The text points directly at the Me Too movement and the cultural enforcement of the believe all women narrative.
Riker's core argument in this chapter is that society has willingly abandoned the foundational pillars of Western jurisprudence: rationality, due process, the burden of proof, and the presumption of innocence.
In favor of pure emotionalism, trial by media, and digital mob rule.
And you really see that in the case studies she selects.
The book brings up Brian Banks, and this one is just heart-wrenching to read. For those who don't know the story, Banks was an elite high school football star, a linebacker with a full ride to USC and a clear path to the NFL.
He lost 5 years of his life in a maximum security prison.
And the entirety of his athletic dreams over a rape accusation that his accuser, years later, casually admitted on a hidden camera was entirely fabricated.
And the author points out the most chilling part. While Banks lost his youth and his future, the accuser faced zero legal consequences for perjury or destroying his life.
Then the book transitions to the infamous Duke lacrosse case from 2006.
Yes, the Duke lacrosse case serves as Riker's prime example of what happens when the media and the justice system collude to prioritize a political narrative over objective truth.
3 players had their lives, their academic careers, and their reputations completely upended by a false accusation from Crystal Mangum.
Riker details how the prosecutor, Mike Nifon, pushed forward despite glaring inconsistencies, fueled by an opportunistic media apparatus that was absolutely desperate to push a narrative of privileged, white, male predators victimizing a vulnerable minority woman.
The author argues that the facts never mattered, the story fit the ideological framework of the gender war, so it was printed as gospel.
And the hits keep coming. The author also heavily details the case of Emma Sulkovich at Columbia University.
Which became known globally as the mattress performance art piece. She carried a mattress around campus to protest her alleged rapist.
Right, and what Riker zeroes in on here is the institutional response. The text notes that the accused student, Paul Nungesser, was cleared by a university investigation, cleared by the police, and sued the university for failing to protect him from harassment.
Yet his reputation was dragged through the mud on an international scale, and Sulkovich was praised by the media and even attended the State of the Union address.
The book frames this entire saga as the ultimate triumph of emotional theatrics over factual justice,
And if we are talking about narrative over truth, we absolutely have to talk about the Rolling Stone article, A Rape on Campus.
which centered on a woman known as Jackie at the University of Virginia.
The book highlights this as a catastrophic, almost unbelievable failure of journalistic ethics. A major legacy magazine completely fabricated a horrific gang rape story, bypassing basic fact-checking protocols, entirely because the stories so perfectly fit their emotional agenda regarding rape culture.
They ruined the lives of fraternity members and university administrators in the process.
Riker even ties in the Jussie Smollett hoax, which obviously isn't about gender, but about race, to make a broader sociological point.
The societal demand for victimhood narratives often far outpaces the actual supply of real bigotry, creating a perverse structural incentive for people to fabricate grievances for social clout and power.
Connecting these disparate cases, the author critiques the foundational legal and psychological frameworks that allow this kind of emotionalism to dictate actual public policy.
And to really understand the depth of her critique, we have to look at how she unpacks the Duluth model.
I'm so glad you brought that up because this is a term that gets thrown around a lot in men's rights circles. But for listeners who aren't familiar with intervention policies, what does the Duluth model actually look like in a real-world police response? And why is Riker so against it?
The Duluth model is the most common framework used by police departments and social workers across the United States to respond to domestic violence calls.
Okay.
Riker criticizes this model heavily because it operates on a deeply ingrained ideological assumption that domestic violence is inherently male-perpetrated, driven by patriarchal control.
In practice, this often means that if police arrive at a domestic dispute, the default protocol heavily leans toward arresting the man,
Even if he has defensive wounds or called the police himself.
The author contrasts this model with empirical data. She cites the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey.
Which the text claims shows that women initiate physical violence in relationships nearly as often as men.
And that non-reciprocal domestic violence, meaning only one partner is violent, is actually initiated by women the majority of the time.
Riker's argument is that institutional policies, like the Duluth model, are based on feminist ideology that purposefully ignores empirical data in order to maintain the overarching narrative of male aggression and perpetual female victimhood.
Which brings us to a major structural pivot in the book, the intersection of feminism and Marxism.
Now, a lot of people think of feminism simply as women wanting the right to vote or equal pay.
But Riker asserts that modern third-wave feminism isn't actually about equality at all. Instead, she argues it is deeply, inextricably rooted in Marxist theory.
She claims feminists have taken Karl Marx's framework of class struggle, the bourgeoisie oppressing the proletariat, and simply swapped the variables.
Now, men are the oppressive bourgeoisie class, and women are the oppressed proletariat.
The book argues that this Marxist rhetoric is being used not to level the playing field, but to establish female supremacy and to completely dismantle the foundational traditional structures of Western civilization.
To map out how this ideological shift actually affected real-world institutions, the book traces this dismantling process back to the cultural revolutions of the 1970s, specifically targeting the introduction of no-fault divorce laws.
Riker argues that radical feminists championed these laws under the guise of liberation.
And the statistical result. The author points out that divorce rates absolutely skyrocketed, fundamentally altering the fabric of American society.
And who paid the price? The text places the burden of this massive societal shift squarely and heavily on the shoulders of children.
Riker cites a mountain of sociological studies indicating that children from broken single-parent homes, which are overwhelmingly headed by mothers, are significantly more likely to experience childhood poverty, severe behavioral issues, juvenile incarceration, and lower academic achievement.
The author essentially claims that no-fault divorce was a deliberate ideological attack on the nuclear family unit, rendering marriage a contract that is uniquely perilous for men to enter.
But the institutional capture doesn't stop at the family court. The book takes a really hard, critical look at academia.
If the family is where values are formed, the university is where they are codified.
And Riker claims that modern universities have transitioned from bastions of free thought and rigorous debate into what she explicitly calls indoctrination camps.
Yes, the text argues that the massive proliferation of gender studies, critical race theory, and grievance-based humanities departments has systematically replaced critical thinking with ideological propaganda.
The author believes this cultural Marxist alliance has successfully captured the administrative state of higher education. Instead of focusing on merit, rigor, and the pursuit of objective truth, these institutions now enforce diversity quotas and ideological purity tests.
Riker claims that modern university students are taught to view the entire world strictly through an intersectional lens of oppression, power dynamics, and victimhood.
More specifically, she argues that young men entering these institutions are essentially taught to apologize for their very existence, pathologized as the root of historical evil.
And speaking of history, the book executes a wildly controversial reframing of the original feminist heroes, the suffragettes.
We are all taught in school that the suffragettes were noble protesters demanding the vote. Riker calls them terrorists.
She highlights the bombings, the arson, and the violence employed by the radical wing of the movement, like Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union in the UK.
She deliberately contrasts this violent, disruptive agitation with women throughout history who achieved true, lasting historical influence through sheer merit and competence.
The author praises women like Catherine de' Medici, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the modern example of Margaret Thatcher.
She argues these women wielded immense, quiet power and shaped global geopolitics without ever once needing to play the victim card or demand special concessions based on their gender.
This historical reframing is absolutely central to the author's critique of what she terms the culture of normalized misandry.
Riker argues that modern society has been so thoroughly conditioned by feminist media and Marxist academic frameworks that we now accept overt anti-male bias as a totally benign cultural default.
It's the water we swim in, so we don't even notice it.
But when she points it out, the examples the book uses are things we see every single day, radiating from our screens. The text points to the infamous 2019 Gillette razor ad, the Best Men Can Be campaign.
Riker dissects this ad, arguing that a corporation took a demographic of loyal male customers and essentially treated them all as latent predators and bullies in desperate need of feminist behavioral correction.
She points to the constant exhausting deadbeat dad and the bumbling, incompetent husband tropes that dominate every sitcom and commercial on television, where the wife is always the hyper-competent, eye-rolling voice of reason.
And perhaps most disturbingly, she highlights the terrifying normalization of social media trends, like the hashtag #KillMen.
She presents this as undeniable evidence that violent, genocidal rhetoric against men is not only tolerated by big tech platforms, but is actively celebrated and defended as punching up under the banner of modern feminism.
The author brilliantly pairs this critique of systemic misandry with a razor-sharp takedown of what she calls fake empowerment.
If modern feminism isn't actually empowering women, what is it doing? The text is highly critical of the modern concept of sexual liberation.
Riker argues that the aggressive promotion of hookup culture, casual sex, and the proliferation of digital platforms like OnlyFans do not liberate or empower women.
Instead, she argues, these mechanisms leave women deeply emotionally damaged, clinically depressed, and ultimately commodified in a hypersexualized, deregulated digital marketplace where they are competing for increasingly scarce commitment from high-value men.
The book takes a very biological stance here. It argues that women are biologically and hormonally wired to form deep emotional attachments through physical intimacy, specifically citing oxytocin release.
And that pushing a hookup culture that demands women act like stereotypical men actually harms them profoundly on a psychological level.
Furthermore, the author argues that decades of feminist social policies haven't actually made women truly independent. They've simply shifted female dependency.
Instead of depending on a husband within a reciprocal marriage, women are now encouraged to depend on the state through massive welfare programs, subsidized housing, and child tax credits.
While the legal system is used to extort men to fit the bill for a family, they're no longer allowed to be a part of.
And that legal extortion, according to the text, is most blatantly evident in the American family court system.
Riker dedicates a massive portion of the book to this, referring to the entire apparatus as the divorce machine.
The divorce machine. She argues it is a multi-billion-dollar industry that feeds on the destruction of the nuclear family, specifically designed to extract wealth from men.
The stories detailed in this section are just tragic. The book outlines the cases of fathers, given the pseudonyms John, Michael, and David, who lost their homes, their life savings, and most importantly, access to their own children.
To back up these anecdotes, the book cites statistics claiming that women receive 97% of all alimony payments and win primary physical custody in over 80% of contested cases.
even when the fathers are demonstrably equally or even more capable of parenting.
The text uses the story of John to illustrate a particularly extreme, yet legally systemic, outcome: paternity fraud.
The book details how John discovered, after nearly a decade of raising a child, that his ex-wife had an affair and the child was not his.
He presented irrefutable DNA evidence to the court. However, according to the book, the judge ruled against him using the legal doctrine of equitable estoppel.
Because John had acted as the father and formed a bond with the child, he was legally forced to pay exorbitant child support for 18 years for a child that was biologically another man's.
While the biological father owed nothing.
The author uses this horrifying legal precedent to argue that the family court system is completely rigged, viewing men not as fathers with inherent rights, but simply as disposable wallets bound to state-enforced servitude.
The societal fallout from this divorce machine, the book claims, is a massive existential crisis. The author points to the statistic that 18.4 million children are currently growing up in the United States without a biological father in the home.
The text doesn't just present this as a sad fact. It correlates this directly with the collapse of civil society.
Riker ties fatherlessness directly to drastically higher rates of generational poverty, violent youth crime, skyrocketing teen drug abuse, and high school dropouts.
The book forces the reader to ask, what happens to a civilization that systematically sidelines, alienates, and financially destroys its fathers?
It's a stark, terrifying question, and answering it transitions the book into Riker's core philosophical argument regarding the fundamental biological nature of men and women.
The text asserts that the entire feminist movement has made a catastrophic foundational error. It has dangerously conflated the concept of equality under the law with biological sameness.
Riker argues that men and women are equal in human dignity, but they are profoundly, irreconcilably different in their biology, psychology, and evolutionary imperatives.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the author leans incredibly heavily into evolutionary biology here.
The book insists that biology dictates societal roles, not the other way around. It argues that testosterone isn't just a social construct or a toxic element to be medicated away.
It's a powerful, vital hormone that biologically hardwires men to protect the perimeter, to build physical infrastructure, to compete for resources, and to lead in times of crisis.
The text argues that trying to erase these biological imperatives in the name of creating a sterile, androgynous, genderless society is not just naive, it is sheer civilization-destroying insanity.
To support this claim that biology cannot be overwritten by policy, the author provides detailed examples of what she views as spectacularly failed social engineering experiments.
The text extensively cites Sweden. Sweden is often held up as the feminist utopia, but Riker points to their push for completely gender-neutral parenting policies and kindergarten curricula.
She claims that instead of creating a genderless utopia, these policies led to intense family breakdowns, an epidemic of childhood anxiety, and what sociologists call the Nordic paradox.
The phenomenon where, in societies with the most egalitarian policies, men and women actually diverge further into stereotypically gendered career choices, proving that free choice maximizes biological preferences.
The book also brings it closer to home, pointing to the collapse of the Twin Oaks commune in Virginia.
This was a community built in the 1960s on the explicit principles of strict gender equality, the abolition of the patriarchy, and perfectly shared labor.
The author argues that this environment, devoid of structured hierarchy and defined gender roles, didn't lead to harmony.
It devolved into chronic inefficiency, interpersonal chaos, and bitter infighting, precisely because it tried to ignore the natural structures that human beings naturally organize themselves into.
Riker uses these examples of failed utopianism to mount a staunch, unapologetic defense of the traditional nuclear family.
The author cites economic data indicating that children raised in married, two-parent biological households are a staggering 82% less likely to live in poverty compared to those in single-parent homes.
Furthermore, the text vehemently rejects the modern feminist push for universal state-funded daycare.
Riker argues that outsourcing child-rearing to low-wage government workers is detrimental to early childhood development. She asserts that children thrive best under the dedicated, loving care of a stay-at-home mother.
The author makes the passionate case that feminism, in its drive to push women into the corporate labor force, has unfairly, maliciously, and destructively devalued the incredibly vital, complex, and socially essential role of the homemaker.
It's a powerful argument that really reframes the conversation around what work is actually valuable. From the micro level of the family, the book then zooms out to the macro level.
Rucker moves on to the broader pillars of society, dedicating a massive section to detailing exactly how specific load-bearing institutions have allegedly been compromised by this exact ideological dogma.
Let's talk about her view on the state of education and science.
The author argues that modern education, from grade school up through the Ivy League, has completely abandoned its foundational roots. She points specifically to the loss of the historical Talmudic tradition.
For listeners who might not be familiar, the Talmudic tradition of learning, often associated with the Shavruta style of study, is based on rigorous, aggressive debate.
Asking constant questions, arguing from multiple perspectives, and deeply wrestling with complex ideas to arrive at the truth.
Riker claims this tradition of intellectual friction has been entirely replaced by a sterile, fragile environment of rote indoctrination.
She argues that today, questioning the prevailing progressive orthodoxy doesn't start a debate. It gets you canceled, fired, or expelled.
The book uses the firing of Google engineer James Damore as the ultimate modern parable for this loss of scientific inquiry.
Riker dives into the details of Damore's infamous internal memo.
The text frames Damore not as a bigot, but as a scientifically minded individual who simply cited mainstream evolutionary psychology to suggest that innate biological differences in interest, not systemic sexism, might explain why fewer women choose to go into high-stress software engineering roles.
The book argues he was immediately fired by Google, not because his science was wrong, but for ideological impurity. He committed blasphemy against the religion of sameness.
The author is absolutely scathing about this, criticizing a society that fires its top engineers for discussing biology, while universities pour millions of dollars into funding absurdities like queer dance theory, while neglecting the rigorous, hard STEM programs that actually build civilization.
Building on that, the author tackles the popular academic feminist critique that science is a patriarchal construct designed to oppress women.
Riker flips this entirely on its head. The text asks a highly pointed, unanswerable question. If the scientific method and technological advancement are inherently patriarchal, why has this patriarchal science saved exponentially more women's lives through modern obstetrics, antibiotics, and sanitation than any other force in human history?
And my favorite example in the whole book. She brings up the humble washing machine.
It sounds funny, but it's brilliant. Riker references theories similar to Heinz Rosling's concept of the magic washing machine.
She argues that this single scientific invention, conceptualized, engineered, and manufactured overwhelmingly by men, did more to truly liberate women from the back-breaking, time-consuming drudgery of domestic labor than any feminist theory, protest, or gender studies paper ever did.
The text claims that modern feminists completely ungratefully ignore the massive technological advancements driven by male engineers and male laborers that actually made modern female independence temporally and physically possible.
Riker then pivots her focus to the institution of media, arguing that it has been totally captured by an unholy alliance of corporate sensationalism and identity politics.
The author contrasts the modern, clickbait, outrage-driven media landscape and the binge-watching culture driven by platforms like Netflix, which the book claims prioritizes algorithmic engagement and ideological messaging over quality, with forms of media that actually explore true ethical depth and systemic complexity.
Right, she's not just complaining about Netflix, she highlights what good media looks like.
The book praises shows like HBO's The Wire or Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom for taking the time to tackle incredibly dense systemic issues with nuance, showing the interconnectedness of poverty, institutions, and human failing without resorting to cheap identity politics.
Furthermore, she highlights digital platforms like Khan Academy.
She points to Sal Khan's work as providing true, democratic, accessible educational innovation and heavily contrasts it with the bloated, overpriced, ideologically captured administrative state of modern universities.
If we connect this critique of education and media to the bigger picture, the final, culminating thematic section of the book addresses what the author sees as the ultimate foundational institutions keeping society from descending into total anarchy: the military, religion, and the arts.
The book's stance on the military is uncompromising and stark. Riker views the military not as a venue for social experimentation or equal opportunity employment, but as the literal shield of civilization.
Its singular purpose is lethality and the protection of the nation-state.
The author brings up a specific, documented 2015 example of a highly qualified male soldier with multiple combat deployments and superior physical scores, who was allegedly explicitly denied a promotion simply so the military command could meet a politically mandated gender quota by promoting a significantly less qualified female colleague.
The text argues that this kind of top-down diversity initiative is actively, dangerously weakening meritocracy of the very force that prevents our society from being conquered by less progressive, more ruthless adversaries.
Moving from the physical shield of society to its metaphysical foundation, the author tackles the role of religion.
Riker argues that the moral, ethical, and transcendent frameworks provided by traditional Christianity and Judaism offer a deeply rooted societal stability that secular feminism and Marxist materialism completely lack.
To illustrate the difference between a movement rooted in transcendent values versus one rooted in Marxist grievance, the text contrasts modern identity politics with the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Riker highlights that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight for equality was deeply, explicitly rooted in his Christian faith.
He appealed to a higher objective moral law and a framework of universal human dignity, arguing that all people are made in the image of God.
Riker argues that modern feminism has abandoned this universal framework in favor of a zero-sum, subjective game of power and revenge.
And finally, the book touches on how these battles are fought in the subconscious realm of culture, sports, and art.
The text uses a fascinating historical example: Coca-Cola's 1930s advertising campaigns featuring Santa Claus.
Riker uses this to demonstrate mimetic engineering, how powerfully art and advertising can shape, manipulate, and literally invent cultural norms.
The author claims that the feminist-captured media apparatus now uses this exact same power of mimetic engineering to consistently portray traditional masculinity as inherently toxic, framing everyday men as either dangerous villains to be feared or bumbling buffoons to be mocked.
The text also references the intense polarization of modern sports, specifically citing Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem.
Riker uses this to show how massive corporate sports leagues have become highly politicized vehicles for progressive messaging.
But again, Riker offers a contrast. She contrasts that highly divisive, corporate, top-down political statement with the quiet, grassroots, unifying power of a local father volunteering his time to coach a youth soccer or Little League baseball team.
The book argues that these local male role models, working within their communities, provide the true mentorship, the discipline, and the community building that the hyper-politicized feminist narrative actively tries to devalue and erase from public life.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a truly massive amount of ground today, unpacking theories from economics to evolutionary biology.
Ultimately, Sophie Marie Eve Riker's book is a passionate, uncompromising call to action for its readers. She is urging you to completely reject the artificial gender war, to reject the commodification of victimhood, and to stop apologizing for biological reality.
The author is arguing for a deliberate return to a society based on traditional complementary gender roles.
She posits that acknowledging, respecting, and valuing the unique, biologically driven contributions of both men and women is not a step backward, but rather the only sustainable path forward to achieve true societal stability, robust families, and lasting civilizational progress.
And as we wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive, we want to remind you once more that our primary goal today was to meticulously map out the controversial, specific, and highly detailed terrain of this source material impartially.
We've spent this time exploring the deep mechanics, the sociological statistics, and the alternative historical frameworks utilized by the author.
Our aim was to allow you to fully understand the architecture of these arguments without us taking a political side or explicitly endorsing the content.
But I do want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds heavily on the text's reliance on evolutionary biology, but pushes it into the future.
Let's hear it.
If, as the book forcefully claims, our biological imperatives, our hormonal drivers, and our historical precedents so heavily favor traditional complementary gender roles, what happens to a highly advanced, automated technological society if it attempts to completely sever itself from these evolutionary roots?
Wow.
As we move into an era of artificial intelligence, artificial wombs, and hyper-virtual realities, does human technology eventually override our biological programming, rendering these traditional masculine and feminine roles permanently obsolete?
Or, as Riker might argue, is human nature immutable? Will our deep-seated biology inevitably rebel against this technological sterilization, forcing a massive, perhaps violent and painful societal correction back to the historical mean?
That is an incredibly profound and slightly terrifying question to chew on as you go about the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for joining us for this ultra long, exhaustive deep dive. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending it wrestling with these heavy concepts with us.
Please, don't forget to like and subscribe to the show right now so we can keep bringing you these deep, unvarnished explorations into the ideas shaping our world.
And remember, if you want to read the raw source material for yourself, to see the citations and judge the arguments firsthand, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook we reviewed today, Cuckoldry and Control, The Dark Side of Feminist Sexual Liberation.
And make sure you follow the author for her ongoing updates, essays, and analysis at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Keep learning, keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.